The wind cut through the dry cornfield. The husks slapped against one another. A continuous sound, almost like a whispered warning. That old man looked down at his calloused hands as the sun dipped below the horizon. Bento was 70 years old. Sweat mixed with red dust trickled down his forehead, knowing this could be his very last night on the family farm. The earth was parched. The accumulated debts with the bank suffocated his chest. Every single acre of that property carried the blood and sweat of 3 generations. Now, only 30 days remained before the public auction. Everything seemed lost. The silence of the night was broken only by the muffled crying of a man who did not know how to start over the next day. Many believe that a man's destiny is shaped solely by his hard work. But the true answer to the salvation of that land lay buried beneath 5 spans of dry earth, in a place he swore he would never open again. Bento walked toward the porch of warped wooden planks. His steps were slow and heavy. He sat down in the old wicker rocking chair. The creaking of the wood seemed to count down the seconds of the time he had left. Beside him, lying on the cold, packed dirt, was the Old One. A mixed-breed dog, his black coat salted white by time. The animal didn't bark. He didn't chase the birds. He just stared fixedly at the top of the hill where the old abandoned cabin at the back of the property resisted time. That structure was not just a storage unit for junk left behind by his grandfather. It was a vault. What kept that dog so bound to that specific spot? Bento remembered his father's warnings. Never dig near Diogo's cabin. Never question the boundaries of that hill. The bank didn't just want the accumulated interest money. They wanted the soil itself. The local branch manager had visited the farm 3 times that week. He wasn't offering deals. He was offering total surrender. Bento looked up at the starry night sky of the countryside. The fog was beginning to descend over the dry cornfield. The cold seeped through the cracks of his worn denim shirt. The loneliness of a man with no heirs and no safety net weighed more than the sacks of grain he had carried his entire life. The Old One let out a low whimpering groan. An almost human sound of lamentation. Something was changing in the air of that freezing night. The silence of the countryside hides terrible secrets. Bento knew that every inch of that farm had a hidden history, but poverty had made him forget the past. The collection letters piled on the kitchen table were witnesses to his imminent defeat. The tractor lay broken in the shed. The irrigation pipes were bone dry and cracked by the merciless August sun. If he lost this land, where would a 70-year-old man go with spent hands and a tired body? The Old One suddenly raised his head. His ears curved forward. He growled softly into the dark. The mystery that was about to unfold would leave no time for mourning. Midnight arrived with a dense, gray fog. Bento woke with a start to an insistent sound coming from outside. It wasn't the wind. It was a continuous, rhythmic scratching coming straight from the middle of the cornfield. He lit the old kerosene lamp with a trembling match. The yellowish flame flickered slightly, casting long, misshapen shadows on the bare wooden walls of the house. Bento stepped out onto the packed dirt yard. The Old One was not in his usual spot under the porch. The man followed the disturbing noise. The dim light of the lamp sliced through the thick darkness, revealing the dry corn stalks that looked like extended claws in the dark. His feet sank into the fine dust of the drought. The sound of nails scraping against something solid came exactly from the base of the old iron flagpole where the farm's flag used to fly. There lay the dog. His front paws were digging into the earth with a frightening fury that Bento had never seen before in the gentle animal. The dog's nails were already bleeding slightly against the hard, pebble-strewn earth. Bento approached carefully, raising the lamp above his head. "Stop, Old One. You're going to hurt yourself like that," he ordered, his voice hoarse and trembling. The dog stopped instantly. He turned his head slowly and looked at his owner, his eyes shining intensely under the yellow light of the lamp. Then, he barked a single time, a sharp, piercing sound that echoed through the entire lowland of the farm and seemed to awaken the ghosts of the past. Bento lowered the lamp to ground level. At the bottom of the small hole dug by the animal, something metallic gleamed dully. It was not a common quartz stone. The man knelt with difficulty in the dirt. The chronic pain in his left knee protested intensely at the impact. He pushed away the loose soil with his own calloused hands. His fingers brushed against a cold, cylindrical, and rough surface. It was a heavy metal capsule, an old brass military tube used by the Army for field communications in the last century. The object was hermetically sealed with a thick layer of red wax, worn and cracked by time. Bento's heart raced dangerously in his chest. His hands shook visibly as he held the heavy, cold tube. The old one sat beside him in the dust, panting heavily, tongue out, his eyes locked onto the object. He seemed to have fulfilled an ancestral mission of guardianship. Bento tried to twist the brass cap right there in the darkness. The ancient metal was completely jammed by decades of rust from being buried. Who would have buried that there with such care? What did that tube contain that was so valuable or dangerous that it justified the animal's generational obsession? The invisible danger of bankruptcy and the shame of the auction seemed distant now, replaced by an ancient mystery pulsing in his trembling hands. Bento knew that opening this would change everything forever, but he could not imagine the sheer depth of the abyss of secrets he was about to uncover in the heart of his own property. He walked back to the house with quick steps, under the watchful and protective gaze of the dog. The kitchen light flickered slightly due to the old wiring. Bento placed the tube on the rustic wooden table. The red wax sealing the cap bore a symbol almost erased by time, an old coat of arms that he could not immediately recognize. Could it be related to the revolution? Was it a family secret his father had taken to the grave? He grabbed a kitchen knife and began to scrape away the hard wax. The sound of the blade against the metal was the only noise in the silent house. The old one lay down near the entrance door, eyes wide open, guarding the outside as if fearing someone would come to claim the object. The night felt eternal. Bento forced the cap with all the strength left in his tired arms. The brass groaned, releasing a greenish powder of verdigris. He knew time was running against him. If that capsule contained nothing but worthless old papers, he would be doomed to sign away the farm in the coming weeks. But the animal's behavior did not lie. There was something deeply wrong and profoundly valuable hidden beneath the roots of that dry cornfield. Bento delivered one last firm strike to the edge of the tube. The cap began to yield millimeter by millimeter. The secret was about to surface in the loneliness of that abandoned kitchen. The next morning brought a gray, cold, and lifeless light that could barely warm the house. Bento spent the first hours of the day at the wooden workbench of his mechanical workshop in the back of the shed. Using penetrating oil and an industrial screwdriver to force the brass tube's cap, he worked without pause. When the metal finally gave way with a sharp, dry snap that echoed through the empty shed, a strong odor of musty paper, dampness, and old gunpowder flooded the confined air. From inside the tube, with extreme care not to tear the parched material, he pulled out a map drawn by hand on yellowed paper and a small diary with a faded, worn cowhide cover. The diary originally belonged to Diogo, his paternal grandfather. The handwriting was ornate, firm, and written with a thick-stroked black fountain pen. Bento began to read the accounts, his eyes narrowing from the lack of light. The words revealed a hidden military history that the family itself had tried to erase from local memory out of pure fear of government retaliation. The farm had not been bought with ordinary harvest money. In 1932, during the Constitutionalist Revolution, the isolated property had served as a strategic refuge and secret supply point for retreating troops. Bento turned to the leather pages with an almost religious care. The paper was so fragile it felt as though it would crumble into flakes at the slightest rough touch. The handwritten text detailed a lost cargo of high strategic value, a large crate of confidential supplies from the provisional government that never reached its official destination due to the siege by federal troops. His grandfather had written on the very last page in his own hand, "The gold of the coalition is safe, where the eye of the earth does not blink. The watchdog knows the exact path to salvation, but the earth demands eternal silence from whoever finds it." Bento furrowed his brow in confusion. It sounded like the madness of an old man or a romantic legend from wartime. But the obsessive behavior of the old one, the farm's current dog, suggested something very different and frighteningly real. The animals of that specific lineage were always born and died within the boundaries of the farm. The old one was a direct great-great-grandson of Diogo's first guard dog. Could it be biologically possible that the instinct to track that exact excavation point had been passed down from generation to generation, like a silent genetic command? To seek concrete historical and legal answers to this madness, Bento tucked the documents into his jacket, grabbed his loud, aging pickup truck, and drove to the real estate registry office in the neighboring town. The public building was an old 19th century construction with a heavy smell of mold, old papers, and gray steel filing cabinets that screeched loudly every time a drawer was opened. Dr. Arnaldo, the head archivist of the registry office, examined the old map brought by Bento with a large brass magnifying glass. He looked long and hard at the farmer over the thick lenses of his glasses, clearing his throat before speaking. Bento, these 1932 military records are extremely complicated and dangerous. Your current farm belonged to an area of undeclared military expropriation on the civil maps of the time. If your grandfather found anything of value during that time of chaos, legally under current laws, it was never his property. But there is a marginal note here in this official registry book that catches my attention. A complete inventory of confiscated goods that mysteriously vanished from the Central Archive on the exact day the Peace and Amnesty Treaty was signed by the remaining forces. Bento swallowed hard, his mouth feeling as dry as the cornfield. The lead was real. The mystery was no simple legend to scare children on cold nights. It was a state secret buried in the backyard of his own home. The imminent danger of losing the farm to the bank auction now mingled with the paralyzing fear of unearthing what should have been forgotten forever in the mists of history. Bento thanked the archivist with a nod and left the office. The old farmer's mind was working at high speed. Dr. Arnaldo had confirmed that the area had been targeted since the end of the revolution. There were powerful forces moving pieces on the chessboard of that small town. He got into the truck and slammed the door hard. The diesel engine coughed before starting. On the way back to the farm, he noticed a black car with dark windows parked at the exit of the town. The vehicle began to follow him at a distance along the dirt road. The danger was no longer a theoretical assumption. The mystery was drawing the attention of people who preferred to keep the past locked away under lock and key. He accelerated the old vehicle, kicking up a curtain of dust to throw off his pursuers. He needed to reach the farm before it was too late. Bento returned to the farm when the sun had completely hidden behind the dark mountains, leaving the property in twilight. The old one was anxiously waiting for him at the entrance of the hill trail near Diogo's abandoned cabin. The man climbed down from the truck, his muscles locked up, firmly holding a sharp spade and a forged iron pickaxe. He methodically followed the geometric markings on his grandfather's map, which he had brought in his pocket. The coordinates of the drawing intersected exactly with the soapstone structural foundation of the old wooden cabin. The dog began to whine softly, a sharp sound of nervous anticipation that made the hairs on the farmer's neck stand up. Bento stepped into the ruined cabin. The collapsed roof in several places revealed the first stars of the cold night. The floor consisted of thick planks of genuine IP wood, darkened by time, mold, and the accumulated grime of decades of neglect. He began to break the floor with violent blows of the pickaxe. The hard hardwood resisted bravely, throwing off heavy splinters that flew into the dark of the cabin. After 2 long hours of uninterrupted and heavy physical labor, Bento's arms burned with pure exhaustion, and sweat poured into his eyes. The pickaxe finally struck something that was neither foundation stone nor floorwood. A metallic, hollow, and deep sound echoed throughout the empty cabin. Bento cleared away the debris and black dirt with his own bare hands, oblivious to the cuts on his palms. A large cast iron plate bearing the embossed coat of arms of the old oligarchic republic was revealed there. It was not a simple wooden crate buried in the haste of war. It was the fortified ceiling of a complete underground military bunker. With great physical effort, using a thick iron bar as an improvised lever, Bento lifted the heavy iron hatch. A gust of confined, icy air smelling of chemical decay hit his wrinkled face directly. He descended the narrow soapstone steps with the kerosene lamp in his right hand. The old one followed him step by step without hesitating for a single second. Down there, in the enclosed space, the light from the lamp revealed what Bento was absolutely certain would be the financial treasure in coins or gold bars to save his life from imminent bankruptcy. But what he saw in that basement froze his blood immediately. There were no shiny gold bars or crown jewels. There were only completely empty ammunition crates, rotted by dampness. In the exact center of the concrete room sat a steel desk holding dozens of folders of official documents, stamped and dated from only 30 years ago. Bento approached the desk with trembling legs and began to flip through the pages of letterhead from the very same private bank that was enforcing his current unpayable debt. The grand revelation hit the old farmer like a violent punch to the stomach. The private bank was not trying to seize his farm because of recent agricultural failures or harvest debts. The current bank was directly owned by the direct descendants of the federal general who had lost the strategic military cargo in that same area in 1932. They knew perfectly well about the secret of the bunker through wartime diaries from the opposing faction. The fictitious rural debts and recurring abusive interest rates were deliberately engineered by the bank's board over the last 3 decades to legally force Bento's family to abandon the land through bankruptcy, without the financial institution needing to conduct public excavations that would draw the federal government's attention to the bunker. Bento's financial ruin was not bad luck or incompetence in the fields. It was a macabre plan of family vengeance and historical greed, executed in absolute corporate silence for more than 30 years. Bento felt tears of rage stream down his sun-furrowed cheeks. He gripped the papers so tightly that the corners tore. The bank had set contractual traps in every loan his father and he had signed. They controlled the price of supplies at the local cooperative. They bribed the agricultural experts who evaluated the land's productivity. It all made sense now. The crop failure 5 years ago, which had started the snowball of debt, had been caused by a batch of adulterated seeds that the bank branch had forced him to buy as collateral for the loan. They wanted to suffocate him until he handed over the keys to the farm of his own free will. The old one approached the iron desk and placed his front paw on one of the smaller dark blue folders. There was one more secret kept in that concrete room. A legal detail that the bank's senior lawyers hoped Bento would die without ever discovering. The truth lay exposed on those yellowed archive sheets. Bento's supposed millionaire debt was a legalized legal fraud, coldly assembled to steal the legitimate legacy of his grandfather Diogo. At the back of the last dark blue folder, Bento found an original document that the bank's senior lawyers tried to hide at all costs. An international war insurance policy, issued in the name of the rural property by foreign insurers in 1935. This document stipulated that the dividends and war indemnities accumulated extraordinary compound interest in favor of the direct heirs, provided the land was maintained and defended by the same family lineage for more than 3 consecutive generations without prior sale. The financial value of that updated historic policy not only easily paid off the bank's fraudulent debt, but made the historic farm completely self-sufficient and wealthy for the next 100 years of history. The bank's board of directors knew this perfectly well. They needed to tear Bento away from there before the policy's 60-year statute of limitations expired completely. And that legal deadline expired exactly the next day, at 5 o'clock in the afternoon. Bento climbed the stone steps of the bunker, his spine straighter than it had been in the last 20 years. The morning sun began to rise on the countryside horizon, painting the once gray sky a vivid, intense gold and pink. The strong wind blowing through the cornfield now sounded like an epic song of ancestral victory, no longer a whisper warning of ruin. He looked with deep gratitude at the old one. The dog lay down calmly on the planks of the main house's porch, closing his tired eyes for a well-deserved and final rest. The guard mission of his biological lineage was finally fulfilled after nearly a century of silent vigil. The next day, at the final hour of the deadline, Bento walked into the courtroom of the local district accompanied by a federal prosecutor whom he had summoned that very night with the undeniable evidence extracted from the underground bunker. The bank's legal representatives, upon seeing the original historical documents and the signed war policy, turned pale and immediately withdrew all collection lawsuits. The judicial execution of the debt was annulled by the judge on duty with irrevocable status. The historic farm was definitively saved and free from any corporate threat. You who are watching this emotional journey to the end here on the channel, look closely at your own daily battles in your personal or professional life. Sometimes, the crushing weight you carry today on your shoulders, the financial or emotional crisis that seems completely unfair, cruel, and without any apparent way out, is by no means a sign that you have failed as a human being or that you have been abandoned in the desert. It may just be the invisible reflection of hidden forces or past trials that you do not yet fully understand. trying in every way to make you give up and abandon what is yours by sacred right of inheritance. The unwavering persistence of old Bento and the protective instinct of that lonely dog clearly show us that truth and divine justice have a very specific and perfect time to flourish in the soil of the earth. Do not abandon your land of labor. Do not give up on your cornfield in the middle of the drought. What today seems to be your ultimate ruin may just be the sacred ground that hides your greatest liberation and your greatest wealth for the future. Hold fast on your journey. Your day of harvest and victory will come faster than you imagine. Like the video, subscribe to the channel for more impactful real stories like this one, and until the next journey.
She thought the old cabin would be empty, forgotten, just another place where memories went to die. But when she forced open the attic door, she found a room untouched by time, and a message her mother had been writing for 15 years, waiting for the impossible day her daughter would finally come home. Stay with this story, because what Maya discovers inside that attic changes everything she believed about her past. The sound of waves crashing against the cliffs below had never changed. Even after 15 years, the ocean still breathed with the same rhythm Maya remembered as a little girl. Salt filled the cool afternoon air as she stepped out of the old taxi and stared silently at the narrow dirt path leading toward the cabin. It stood exactly where memory had left it, perched on the edge of the rocky coastline as though it had been patiently waiting for someone who never came. The wooden walls had faded beneath years of rain and sea wind. Several shingles were missing from the roof. Wild grass surrounded the porch, and ivy climbed across the weathered boards. Anyone else would have called it abandoned. Maya couldn't. Every corner of that fragile house still whispered her mother's name. She tightened her grip around the small brass key the attorney had handed her only 2 days earlier. He had spoken carefully, almost apologetically, explaining that the property had remained legally untouched for years because no one had known where Maya had been after entering foster care. There had been no fortune waiting for her, no hidden bank account, no valuable inheritance, just an old cabin overlooking the Atlantic Ocean and a handwritten letter containing only one sentence. If you ever find your way back, start with the attic. She had read those words dozens of times during the long bus ride. They refused to leave her mind. The porch groaned beneath her boots as she climbed the first step. The front door resisted before finally opening with a deep wooden creak that echoed through the silent rooms. A wave of cool, stale air drifted toward her, carrying the unmistakable scent of old timber, salt, forgotten books, and years of solitude. Dust floated lazily through thin rays of afternoon sunlight slipping between cracked curtains. Nothing had been stolen. Nothing had been rearranged. The old fireplace remained exactly where it had always stood. Her mother's rocking chair still faced the ocean window. A faded knitted blanket rested neatly across its arm, as though someone had folded it only yesterday before stepping outside for a short walk. Maya slowly crossed the room, her fingertips brushing the worn wood of the dining table. Tiny scratches marked its surface. She remembered making them with colored pencils while her mother baked bread in the tiny kitchen. The memory appeared so suddenly that it stole the air from her lungs. She closed her eyes. For one brief moment, she could almost hear laughter again. Then silence returned. The staircase waited at the end of the hallway. Every step protested beneath her weight with long, familiar groans. The higher she climbed, the colder the air became. Family photographs still lined the walls, faded almost beyond recognition. Some had slipped sideways inside their frames. Others had gathered thin layers of dust that softened every smiling face. Maya paused before one picture where her younger self stood, wrapped inside her mother's arms. She barely recognized the little girl smiling back at her. "I don't even remember this day," she whispered. Only the ocean answered. At the end of the hallway stood a narrow wooden hatch leading upward, the attic, exactly where the letter had told her to begin. Unlike every other door inside the cabin, this one was wrapped in heavy rusted chains held together by an ancient iron lock. Maya frowned. Why would anyone lock away an attic inside an abandoned cabin? She knelt beside the lock. Years of corrosion had weakened the metal. Using an old hammer she found inside a nearby closet, and nearly all of her strength, she struck the chain again and again. Each blow echoed through the empty house. Rust scattered across the floor. Her hands ached. Sweat rolled down her forehead despite the cold air drifting through broken windows. One final strike. The chain snapped. The heavy links crashed onto the wooden floor. For several seconds, Maya simply stared at the unopened door. Her heartbeat grew louder than the ocean outside. Slowly, she reached for the handle. The hinges released a long, tired groan as Maya slowly pushed the attic door inward. She expected darkness, thick dust, broken furniture, and forgotten boxes stacked carelessly beneath the roof. Instead, warm evening light spilled across polished wooden floors. She froze. The room was impossibly clean. Sunlight entered through two perfectly clear windows overlooking the endless ocean, painting golden lines across neatly arranged shelves filled with books, folded blankets, and carefully labeled wooden boxes. There were no spider webs, no dust drifting through the air. Even the scent was different. Instead of decay, the attic carried the comforting aroma of cedar wood, dried lavender, and old paper that had somehow remained untouched by time. It felt less like an attic and more like a sanctuary preserved inside the heart of the cabin. Maya stepped inside almost afraid to breathe, as though one careless movement might disturb years of silent waiting. Every object seemed intentionally placed. A small writing desk faced the sea. Beside it rested an oil lamp, still filled with fuel. A porcelain teacup sat on a delicate lace cloth. The chair had been gently pulled back as though someone had only stepped away for a moment and planned to return before sunset. Maya slowly walked toward the window. The same cliffs she remembered stretched endlessly beneath the crashing waves. Seagulls circled below, their cries carried upward by the ocean wind. Nothing outside had changed. Yet inside this room, time itself appeared to have stopped. Against one wall stood a tall bookshelf filled with journals, each bound in faded blue leather. Every spine carried a single year written carefully in gold ink. 2011, 2012, 2013, one for every year since Maya had disappeared from this place. Her fingers trembled as she reached toward the oldest volume. Before touching it, however, something else caught her attention. Resting alone in the center of the desk was a single envelope with her name written across the front in unmistakable handwriting. She recognized those graceful letters instantly. Her mother's handwriting. The sight stole every ounce of strength from her legs. She sank slowly into the upholstered chair beside the desk, unable to look away. Tears blurred her vision before she had even broken the faded wax seal. Her heartbeat echoed loudly inside the silent room. The paper crackled softly as she unfolded the letter with both hands. The ink had faded slightly with age, but every word remained perfectly readable. My dearest Maya, if your hands are holding this letter, then life has finally been kinder than I ever dared to pray. Every night I climbed these stairs hoping tomorrow would bring you home. Every night I wrote because I refused to let time erase our story. If I could not stay beside you, then my words would. Maya covered her mouth as tears streamed silently down her cheeks. She had spent 15 years believing she had been abandoned, believing her mother had simply disappeared without searching for her. But these first few sentences shattered everything she thought she knew. She looked around the room once more. Suddenly, every object carried new meaning. The lamp had been filled because someone expected another evening of writing. The blankets had been folded because someone believed a daughter would one day need warmth. The chair beside the desk had never been moved because someone had always imagined two people sitting there together again. Maya gently placed the letter on the desk before reaching toward the first journal. The cover felt smooth despite its age. When she opened the first page, she found a date followed by a single sentence written carefully across the top. Day 1, without Maya. Today, I promised myself that hope would outlive my fear. Maya stopped breathing. There were hundreds of pages beneath that first entry, hundreds of nights, hundreds of prayers, hundreds of stories waiting patiently for the daughter they had been written for. And for the very first time since losing everything as a frightened little girl, Maya no longer felt like someone who had been forgotten. She felt like someone who had finally been found. Maya turned the next page with trembling fingers, almost afraid that the words would vanish if she moved too quickly. The handwriting remained steady, elegant, and full of quiet determination. Her mother had written about ordinary mornings when rain covered the cliffs with mist, about repairing loose boards on the porch alone, about baking bread even though there was no one left to share it with. Every page carried the same invisible companion. Maya. It was as if every sunrise had begun with the hope that footsteps would appear outside the cabin before nightfall. One entry described how Evelyn still prepared a second plate at dinner every Sunday because she could not bear the thought of giving up on the ritual they had once shared. Another spoke of placing fresh wildflowers beside Maya's childhood bed every spring, replacing them each week even though no one ever slept there. Maya could barely continue reading through the tears. She had believed the silence meant she had been forgotten. Instead, it had been filled every single day with someone refusing to stop loving her. Hours slipped by unnoticed as the golden light outside slowly softened into shades of orange and deep blue. The attic grew quieter while the ocean continued its endless conversation with the cliffs below. Maya reached another journal several years later. The tone had changed. Evelyn's handwriting looked slightly weaker, but her hope remained untouched. Today, the doctor asked if there was anyone who could stay with me. I smiled and told him my daughter would come one day. He looked at me with pity. I don't blame him. He cannot see what a mother's heart knows. Maya lowered the diary into her lap and stared through the attic window. Her chest tightened painfully. If these entries were true, then her mother had never stopped waiting, never stopped believing. The realization was almost too overwhelming to accept. She wiped her face and continued reading until a folded map slipped from between the pages and landed softly on the floor. It was old and worn from being opened many times. Across the coastline, a careful red line had been drawn from the cabin to a small village several miles north. Beside a tiny church overlooking the sea, someone had written a single sentence in blue ink. If Maya comes home after I am gone, tell her I waited with peace. Her pulse quickened. Beneath the note was a name she had never seen before. Father Thomas, along with a telephone number that might no longer exist. She immediately searched the desk drawers. Inside, she found neatly organized envelopes, dozens of photographs, official documents from the orphanage, copies of letters that had never been answered and receipts proving her mother had spent years hiring private investigators, writing government offices, and searching every possible record that might lead to her missing daughter. Maya's entire understanding of her childhood collapsed within minutes. Her mother had never abandoned her. She had fought for her with everything she possessed until there was nothing left except hope. Then, beneath the final stack of papers, Maya discovered a small wooden box secured with a tiny brass latch. Inside rested a silver compass, its surface worn smooth by years of careful handling. Attached to it was a faded ribbon and another handwritten note. You used to carry this everywhere because you believed it always pointed home. The world may confuse your path, but love never loses its direction. Maya closed her fingers around the compass. The needle spun wildly for a few seconds before settling toward the coastline outside the window. She smiled through fresh tears. It was the first genuine smile she could remember given in years. For so long, she had searched for family in strangers, for belonging in temporary places, and for peace inside unanswered questions. Yet the answers had been waiting quietly beneath the roof of a forgotten cabin overlooking the sea. She looked once more at the map, the church marked in red, and the name Father Thomas written carefully beneath it. Somewhere beyond those cliffs, someone might still know the final chapter her mother had never been able to write. Maya carefully placed every journal back onto the shelf exactly as she had found them. Then she slipped the compass into her pocket, folded the map inside her backpack, and held the first diary tightly against her chest before walking toward the attic door. She had arrived believing she was returning to an empty house. She was leaving with something far greater than an inheritance. She was carrying 15 years of unwavering love, and the first real clue that could finally lead her all the way home. The sky had turned a deep shade of violet by the time Maya stepped out onto the porch, the first stars beginning to appear above the endless ocean. The wind felt different now, softer, warmer. It no longer carried the loneliness she had felt when she first arrived. She locked the cabin carefully, slipping the old brass key back into her pocket as though she had become its guardian instead of its visitor. Before walking away, she turned once more toward the weathered house standing proudly against the cliffs. For years, she had imagined it as a symbol of everything she had lost. Now she understood it had been protecting everything she still had. The journals, the letters, the memories, her mother's faith. They had all survived because this quiet little cabin had refused to surrender to time. Maya looked down at the folded map resting inside her hands. The village, marked in red, was less than an hour away by car. If the note was accurate, someone there had known her mother during her final years. Someone had been trusted with the truth. She climbed into the aging pickup truck she had rented that morning and followed the narrow coastal road illuminated only by the fading light of dusk. The ocean remained beside her almost the entire drive, crashing endlessly against towering cliffs below. Every curve in the road revealed another breathtaking view, yet Maya barely noticed them. Her thoughts remained fixed on the diaries. Every sentence she had read echoed inside her mind. Every sacrifice, every unanswered letter, every prayer. She could no longer remember the face of the frightened little girl who believed she had been abandoned. That child had been replaced by someone carrying undeniable proof that she had been loved every single day. 40 minutes later, the lights of a tiny fishing village appeared ahead. Small wooden houses lined the harbor where dozens of boats rocked gently beneath yellow dock lights. At the highest point of the village stood a modest white church overlooking both the sea and the clustered rooftops below. Maya parked near the entrance and slowly climbed the stone steps leading toward the old building. The church was silent except for the distant ringing of a bell somewhere inside. A single light glowed through one stained glass window. She hesitated before opening the heavy wooden door. Warm candlelight filled the sanctuary. The scent of old wood and melted wax wrapped around her instantly. An elderly priest was carefully extinguishing candles near the altar when he noticed her standing quietly near the entrance. His silver hair caught the golden light as he looked toward her with gentle curiosity. Before Maya could even introduce herself, his expression changed completely. His eyes widened. His hands froze. For several long seconds, neither of them spoke. Finally, almost in disbelief, the old priest whispered words that made Maya's heart stop. Those eyes. He took one slow step closer, studying her face with growing emotion. You have Evelyn's eyes. Maya felt tears gathering once again. She reached into her backpack and carefully removed the first blue journal before holding it toward him with trembling hands. My name is Maya Carter. The priest's lips trembled. He closed his eyes for a brief moment as though silently thanking heaven for something he had stopped expecting years ago. When he looked back at her, tears filled his own eyes. She asked me to watch for you, he whispered. Every Sunday, for 15 years. She would ask me the same question. His voice cracked. Has my daughter come home yet? Maya covered her mouth, unable to hold back the tears any longer. Father Thomas slowly walked toward one of the wooden pews and motioned for her to sit beside him. From inside his worn leather satchel, he carefully removed a small sealed envelope whose edges had yellowed with age. Written across the front, in the same graceful handwriting she now recognized instantly, were 5 simple words. Only if Maya returns alive. Father Thomas held the envelope with both hands for a moment before placing it gently into Maya's palms. She made me promise, he said quietly. No matter how many years passed, no matter what happened, this could belong to no one except you. Maya stared silently at the unopened envelope. It felt heavier than paper should. Whatever waited inside had survived 15 years of hope, heartbreak, and unanswered prayers. Slowly, she broke the faded wax seal. Inside was one final handwritten letter, and a small photograph she had never seen before. It showed her mother standing beside another person whose face had been carefully folded beneath the edge of the paper, as though someone had intentionally hidden their identity. On the back of the photograph, one sentence had been written in blue ink. The greatest secret I protected was never inside the cabin. It was the truth about your father. Maya's fingers tightened around the photograph as though she feared it might disappear if she loosened her grip. Her breathing became slow and uneven. For years, she had imagined countless versions of the man she had never known. Some kind, some cruel, some heroic, others cowardly. In the end, she had stopped wondering altogether because unanswered questions hurt less than endless hope. Yet now, with one faded photograph resting in her hands, every forgotten question returned at once. She carefully unfolded the corner that had hidden the second figure. An older man stood beside Evelyn on the cliff overlooking the cabin. He was tall, with dark hair streaked with gray, and the same unmistakable green eyes Maya saw every morning in her own reflection. His hand rested protectively on Evelyn's shoulder while both smiled toward someone standing behind the camera. It was the smile of two people planning a future they believed would last forever. On the back of the picture, another sentence appeared beneath the first. His name is Daniel Carter. If fate is kind, he is still searching too. Maya lowered the photograph into her lap, unable to speak. Father Thomas remained silent, allowing the weight of the moment to settle naturally. After several minutes, he finally looked toward the stained glass windows glowing beneath the moonlight. "Your mother never stopped believing your father would return," he said softly. "The morning you disappeared, Daniel was already out at sea working aboard a rescue vessel. A violent storm struck that afternoon. Communication failed along the coast for nearly 2 days. By the time he reached home..." The priest paused, swallowing carefully. "Both of you were gone." Maya listened without interrupting. Every sentence rearranged another piece of a life she had misunderstood for 15 years. "Authorities believed you had wandered away after the accident on the cliffs," Father Thomas continued. "But your mother never accepted that explanation. She searched every hospital, every shelter, every neighboring town. Daniel searched farther. He traveled from state to state following every rumor that even remotely resembled a missing little girl. The years slowly consumed everything they owned." Maya felt tears warming her cheeks once more. "Then why?" she whispered. "Why did I end up believing she abandoned me?" Father Thomas sighed deeply before answering. "Because the system failed both of you. Records were misplaced. Names were changed during emergency transfers after the storm. By the time your mother located the orphanage where you had briefly stayed, you had already been moved hundreds of miles away under temporary guardianship. Every trail ended just before she arrived." Maya closed her eyes. It had not been one terrible decision. It had been dozens of small tragedies unfolding one after another until the distance between mother and daughter became almost impossible to cross. Father Thomas gently pointed toward the letter, still resting unopened beside the photograph. She wanted those words to come directly from her. Maya nodded slowly before unfolding the final pages. Her mother's handwriting appeared steadier than ever, each sentence written with extraordinary care. "My beautiful Maya, if you're reading this, then I was right to keep believing. There were days when loneliness convinced me I had already lost everything. But every evening I climbed to the attic and wrote another page because I refused to let the world tell me our story had ended. If I could leave you only one inheritance, it would not be this cabin. It would not be these journals. It would be certainty. Never measure love by distance. Never measure family by time. Hearts that truly belong together keep walking toward each other, even when the road disappears." Maya could no longer hold back the tears. They fell freely onto the pages without shame. "If your father is still alive, find him. Not because either of us needs forgiveness. There was never anything to forgive. We were simply separated by storms no one could control. Tell him I loved him until my final breath. Tell him I never stopped waiting, and tell yourself something every morning that I wish I could still whisper beside you. You were never abandoned. You were always loved." Silence filled the little church once more. Outside, waves continued breaking against the cliffs exactly as they had throughout Maya's entire life. Yet nothing sounded the same anymore. She folded the letter carefully and placed it back inside its envelope before looking toward Father Thomas. "Do you know where Daniel is?" she asked quietly. The old priest smiled with tears shining in his eyes. "As a matter of fact..." He reached into his satchel one final time and removed a recent envelope bearing a coastal address less than 30 miles away. "He was here 3 weeks ago." Maya stared at the address in disbelief. Father Thomas nodded gently. "He still comes every year on the anniversary of the day you disappeared. He lights 2 candles, one for his wife, one for the daughter he has never stopped hoping to see walk through that church door. Maya looked toward the moonlit ocean beyond the stained glass window. For 15 years, she believed she had no one left in the world. Tonight, she had discovered that love had been searching for her from both directions all along. Tomorrow morning, for the first time since she was a little girl, she would no longer be searching for the meaning of home. She would be driving toward it. Dawn arrived wrapped in a pale silver mist that floated above the ocean, softening the outline of the cliffs and turning the water into a sheet of moving glass. Maya barely remembered sleeping. She had spent the night inside a small room offered by Father Thomas, reading and rereading her mother's final letter until every word had settled deep inside her heart. Now, as the first rays of sunlight slipped through the church windows, she stood outside beside her truck, holding the folded address that had occupied her thoughts for hours. Less than 30 miles separated her from the man she had imagined 1,000 different ways throughout her life. Daniel Carter, her father. The drive followed the coastline before turning inland through quiet forests of towering pines. Morning dew shimmered across open fields, and small farmhouses appeared every few miles, their chimneys releasing thin columns of smoke into the cool air. Maya's hands remained firmly wrapped around the steering wheel, yet her mind drifted constantly between fear and hope. What if he had forgotten her face? What if seeing her only reopened wounds that had finally begun to heal? What if he had built a new family and no longer had room in his heart for the daughter he had lost? Every possibility tightened the knot inside her chest. Nearly an hour later, the paved road narrowed into a gravel lane bordered by weathered fences and wildflowers dancing in the breeze. At its end stood a modest white farmhouse surrounded by vegetable gardens, apple trees, and a faded red barn. It was beautiful in its simplicity, peaceful, a place built slowly over years rather than inherited overnight. Maya parked beneath an old oak tree, but remained seated for several moments, staring silently at the house. She noticed fishing nets hanging neatly from a wooden fence. A weathered life ring rested beside the porch. Wind chimes made from polished seashells sang softly above the front steps. Every detail seemed to whisper the same story. Someone who had loved the sea had tried very hard to build a life on solid ground. Before she could gather enough courage to knock, the front door opened. An elderly man carrying a watering can stepped onto the porch. His hair had turned almost completely white, and deep lines marked a face shaped by decades beneath sun and salt water. He moved slowly now, but there was still strength in the way he carried himself. He looked toward the driveway, expecting perhaps a delivery or a neighbor. Instead, he saw a young woman standing motionless beside an unfamiliar truck. For a few seconds, he simply watched her. Then the watering can slipped from his hand. Water spilled silently across the porch boards. Maya saw recognition arrive long before either of them spoke. His eyes. They were exactly like hers. Green, gentle, and filled with questions too large for words. Daniel took one hesitant step forward. His lips parted slightly, but no sound came out. Maya felt tears rising before she even realized she was crying. She reached into her backpack and slowly removed the silver compass her mother had saved all those years. Morning sunlight reflected across its worn surface. Daniel's breathing caught. He knew it instantly. "Evelyn," he whispered almost to himself. Maya shook her head softly. "She kept it for me." Daniel's eyes filled with tears. His gaze moved from the compass to Maya's face, studying every feature as though afraid she might disappear if he blinked. "Maya?" The single word broke 15 years of silence. She nodded. That was all it took. Daniel crossed the distance between them with surprising speed despite his age. He stopped only inches away, still unable to believe what stood before him. His trembling hand slowly reached toward her face before pulling back again, uncertain whether he had the right. Maya answered by taking his hand herself and placing it gently against her cheek. The warmth of his rough, weathered palm dissolved every remaining doubt. Daniel collapsed into tears. Not loud sobs, not dramatic cries, just the quiet, exhausted tears of a father whose hope had survived long after reason had disappeared. Maya stepped forward and wrapped her arms around him. He embraced her as though trying to recover every birthday, every Christmas, every bedtime story, and every goodbye that had been stolen from them. Neither spoke. They simply stood together beneath the old oak tree while morning sunlight slowly chased away the mist. Minutes passed before Daniel finally found his voice. "I looked for you everywhere," he whispered. "Every state, every shelter, every newspaper photograph, every little girl someone thought might be you." Maya tightened her embrace. "I know," she answered softly. "Mom told me everything." Daniel closed his eyes. For the first time in 15 years, the unbearable weight of guilt he had carried every single day began to lift. Maya reached into her backpack once more and carefully placed Evelyn's final letter into his trembling hands. He recognized the handwriting immediately. His fingers shook so violently he struggled to unfold the pages. As he began reading, tears streamed freely down his weathered face. The years disappeared. He was no longer an old man standing beside a farmhouse. He was once again the young husband who had promised the love of his life that no storm would ever separate their family. When he reached the final sentence, he pressed the letter gently against his chest and looked toward the ocean visible far beyond the distant hills. "She waited for us," he whispered through tears. Maya nodded. "She never stopped." Daniel smiled sadly. "Neither did I." At that moment, Maya understood something her mother had tried to teach through every page of every journal. Love was never measured by the years people spent together. It was measured by the years they refused to give up on each other, even when the world insisted there was nothing left to hope for. The rest of the morning passed in quiet conversation around Daniel's worn wooden kitchen table. Sunlight streamed through the windows while fresh coffee filled the room with warmth Maya had not realized she had missed her entire life. There were no awkward silences anymore, only two people carefully stitching together 15 stolen years, one memory at a time. Daniel opened old boxes stored inside a hallway closet, each one containing pieces of a daughter he had refused to forget. Newspaper clippings from neighboring towns, maps covered with handwritten notes marking every place he had searched, receipts from private investigators, letters returned unopened after agencies lost track of her records. There were birthday cards addressed to Maya for every single year she had been gone, each one still sealed because Daniel believed she deserved to open them herself someday. Maya read them slowly, smiling through tears. Some were simple. Some contained stories about the sea, about the birds nesting near the cliffs, about the apples growing beside the farmhouse. Every card ended exactly the same way. "Wherever you are, I love you. Dad." She carefully stacked them together before wrapping her arms around him once more. Neither of them could recover the lost years, but both understood something far more important. Love had survived them. That afternoon, they drove together back to the cabin overlooking the ocean. The familiar road no longer felt lonely. Daniel parked beneath the same windswept trees where Maya had stood only a day earlier, believing she was completely alone. Together, they climbed the wooden porch. He paused before opening the front door, his fingertips resting gently against the weathered frame. "The last time I stood here," he whispered, "I believed I had lost both of you forever." Maya reached for his hand. "You're home now." They entered slowly. Nothing inside had changed, yet everything felt different. The silence no longer carried grief, it carried presence. Daniel walked directly toward Evelyn's rocking chair and stopped. A faint smile appeared as he remembered countless evenings watching her knit beside the window while the waves rolled endlessly against the cliffs below. Maya climbed once again into the attic, this time with her father beside her. He stood speechless as sunlight poured across the perfectly preserved room. His eyes moved from the journals to the desk, then to the chair where Evelyn had spent years writing to a daughter she believed would someday return. He gently rested his hand across the stack of blue diaries and closed his eyes. "She kept every promise she ever made," he whispered. Maya nodded quietly. Together, they spent hours reading the journals aloud. Sometimes they laughed at funny childhood memories Evelyn had carefully preserved. Sometimes they cried together when they reached entries describing birthdays spent alone, or another hopeful trip to an orphanage that ended without answers. Yet, even the saddest pages no longer felt unbearable. They had become proof that love could outlast separation, silence, and time itself. As evening approached, Daniel noticed something tucked beneath the false bottom of the writing desk. It was a simple wooden envelope, unlike the others. Inside lay the original deed to the property and one final page written in Evelyn's graceful handwriting. "If you are reading this together, then my greatest prayer has already been answered. This cabin was never meant to become a monument to loss. It was built to remain a place where broken hearts remember how to become a family again. Promise me it will always stay open to those who believe they have nowhere left to go." Maya read the words twice before looking toward her father. Neither of them needed to discuss what they were thinking. The answer arrived naturally. Over the following months, the abandoned cabin slowly came back to life. They repaired the roof together. They restored the porch overlooking the sea. The old attic became a small reading room where Evelyn's journals remained carefully preserved inside glass cases. The downstairs rooms were transformed into a welcoming retreat for children leaving foster care and for families searching for healing after loss. Every visitor who crossed the threshold found warmth, conversation, and hope instead of empty silence. Maya often sat beside the attic window where her mother had once written by lamplight, reading passages from the journals to children who struggled to believe they were loved. Daniel taught them how to fish along the cliffs, how to repair old furniture, and how to listen to the ocean without fearing its storms. The cabin slowly earned a new name among the surrounding villages. People no longer called it the abandoned house on the cliff. They simply called it home. One quiet evening, nearly a year later, Maya stood alone on the porch, watching the sun disappear beneath the horizon exactly as her mother had done countless times before. The waves still crashed against the rocks below with the same endless rhythm. The wind still carried the scent of salt and cedar through the open windows. Some things would never change. She slipped the silver compass from her pocket and smiled as its needle settled calmly toward the cabin behind her. For the first time in her life, it no longer needed to show her the way. She had finally arrived where love had been waiting all along. 5 years passed, and every season left its own quiet mark on the little cabin overlooking the cliffs. Spring covered the hills with wildflowers. Summer filled the shoreline with laughter. Autumn painted the trees in warm shades of gold, and winter wrapped the ocean in silver mist that made the entire coastline seem suspended between memory and hope. Yet, through every changing season, one thing remained constant. The front door of Evelyn's cabin was never locked again. Children who had grown up believing they were unwanted arrived carrying the same uncertainty Maya had once carried. Parents grieving unimaginable losses found silence there without judgment. Foster families came searching for guidance, and volunteers traveled from distant towns simply because someone had told them there was a place on the cliffs where broken hearts somehow felt lighter before leaving. Inside the attic, Evelyn's journals rested safely behind glass, but their true purpose had never been to preserve the past. They became living proof that hope could survive years of unanswered prayers. Maya read passages from them every Saturday afternoon, never as stories of sorrow, but as stories of endurance. She often watched visitors quietly wipe away tears before smiling for the first time in months. Daniel rarely spoke during those gatherings. Instead, he repaired chairs, brewed coffee, welcomed strangers with gentle kindness, and listened far more than he talked. Everyone eventually discovered that the quiet old fisherman understood grief better than most people ever would. His presence alone reminded others that survival did not always arrive with loud victories. Sometimes it arrived one sunrise at a time. One afternoon, a little girl, no older than 8, wandered upstairs while everyone else shared lunch below. Maya found her standing beside the window overlooking the sea, staring at the silver compass displayed inside a small wooden case. "Does it really point home?" the little girl asked softly. Maya smiled before opening the case and placing the compass carefully into her tiny hands. The needle spun once before settling. "It points wherever love is waiting," Maya answered. The child frowned thoughtfully. "What if nobody's waiting for me?" Maya gently knelt until they were looking into each other's eyes. "Someone always is. Sometimes they simply haven't found the road yet." The little girl hugged the compass for a moment before handing it back with a smile Maya recognized immediately. It was the same uncertain smile she herself had carried into the cabin years earlier. Watching that child run downstairs, Maya suddenly understood why her mother had protected this place for so long. The cabin had never been built to save only one family. It existed to remind countless others that despair is rarely the final chapter. Years later, when Maya herself became a mother, she often brought her young son to the cliffs at sunset. Together, they listened to the waves breaking against the rocks while gulls circled high above the water, exactly as they always had. One evening, the little boy asked why they visited the old cabin so often when they already had a comfortable house nearby. Maya lifted him into her arms and pointed toward the attic window glowing warmly beneath the setting sun. "Because this is where our family found each other again," she whispered, "and we never want to forget that miracles sometimes look very ordinary until enough time has passed for us to understand them." After putting her son to bed that night, Maya climbed to the attic one final time. The journals remained exactly where she had promised they always would. The writing desk still faced the ocean. The rocking chair beside the window waited quietly in the fading light. She opened the very first diary to the sentence that had changed everything. Day 1 without Maya. Today I promised myself that hope would outlive my fear. Gently, Maya turned to the final blank page that her mother had never been able to fill. Taking the same fountain pen Evelyn had once used, she wrote only a few lines. Today, your promise came true. The family you refused to give up on is whole again. Your love became our home, and your hope became someone else's beginning. She closed the journal with tears of gratitude rather than sorrow. Outside, the ocean continued its endless song against the cliffs, unchanged by the passing years. It had witnessed loss, waiting, heartbreak, and reunion, yet it never tried to erase any of them. It simply kept moving forward, just as life always does. Maya walked downstairs, leaving the attic door open behind her. Warm light spilled gently across the wooden floor, visible from the porch where evening visitors often arrived carrying burdens no one else could see. The light remained there long after she left, shining quietly toward the sea like a promise that no storm, no matter how fierce, can permanently separate hearts that refuse to stop loving each other. And perhaps that is the greatest inheritance any person can leave behind. Not money, not land, not possessions, but the certainty that somewhere in this world there will always be a light left on, a door left open, and someone who never stopped believing you would eventually find your way home.